Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to work on coloring some comics. I'm pretty new to this still, so this is just my process for now. Please add any tips and things that you do differently in the comments below and we can all learn together. When it was time to start coloring my comic, I was really overwhelmed and didn't really have a direction to go. I ended up doing the first few pages 3 or 4 times. I couldn't really tell what was working and what I liked. I started out with a very limited palette of some warm grays and some greens, and it looked okay, but it wasn't great. It was kind of hard to get the energy and feel that I wanted in each panel. I ended up watching a bunch of YouTube and Skillshare classes and finding the channel Coloring with Kurt. Kurt's channel is a great resource with tons of videos on anything you could need for coloring. I highly recommend if you're struggling with rendering of any kind, go check out Kurt's videos. After I found that channel, I ended up abandoning the fixed palette and went with something a bit more loose, and I think the end result feels a lot more like what I wanted. We're gonna go through the basic process here today and cover how I go about coloring these comic pages. Really quick, we're gonna go through the layer stack of what the page looks like once it's complete. The top layers will always be the panel borders, so that I end up with clean edges, and then the speech bubbles and text go on top of those. There are a few hard light layers here at the top for reflections, highlights, glow, and light effects. And then under that is the line art and the sound effects. Then comes the multiply shadow layers. I have 2 for this page. I mostly end up with just 1 layer, but I had a lot of shadows in that first panel that needed a little bit of extra punch up. Then we have the gradients. This is the area where I add blended color changes like skin, and then the next layer down is the flat colors. I call this next layer the ugly flats because they are hideous, but they do make the process a lot easier. The last layer in the stack is the panel selection layer. This helps me be able to cleanly select the panel that I want to work in and break the process into smaller chunks. This is where we ended up after the inking video. The inks are complete, the sketches are turned off, the panel borders are on a separate layer. We're ready to start coloring these panels. We need to set up a few tools first. We went over the custom selection tools in the inking video, but here's a quick look at those settings again. We're also going to use a custom fill bucket, and here's what the settings for that tool look like. I like to duplicate these tools and make a dedicated tool when I'm building these custom ones because I end up using them so much. It's also helpful to have a dedicated add lasso and subtract lasso set up. I made these by duplicating and renaming the tool and then just changing the settings. The first task we need to tackle is separating the panels. I'm going to set the panel borders to the reference layer and make a new layer under the line art. I filled this layer with white, and now I'm going to use the select tool to select the inside of the top panel and then fill it with a different color. It doesn't matter what the color is at this point. I tend to keep the panels in the same hue range just so it doesn't bug out my eyes too much. It can be kind of weird and ugly if you do a rainbow, unless that's the vibe you're going for. After I fill that first panel, I'm gonna deselect and then continue this process for the rest of the panels on the page. After we have our panels sectioned off, we can start to break down the objects in each panel. You can do this several different ways. I feel like the lasso works the best for me right now, but I have also used the select and fill tool from the clip store. There's instructions on downloading and using that tool in the Color Faster with Clip Studio Paint video on this channel. I'm going to set the panel layer that we just finished to the reference, and then I'm going to copy it and start selecting the biggest bits of the first panel. I'm only paying close attention to breaking up the parts of the panel that are the same color Anything that's touching another color like the white outside of the panel, the custom fill bucket will take care of on its own. I like to work in smaller areas and then use the lasso add tool to add bits onto those until it covers the whole selection range that I need. When the selection is done, I'm going to use the custom fill bucket and tap the area that I want the color. It will fill up to the edges of the selection and to any other colors. I'm going to continue working my way through the panel using this method. The goal is to not select the same edge more than once. I find that tiny details are a bit harder with this method, so I tend to include them in a larger selection and come back to them later with another CSP store tool called Lasso Fill and just fill in those little tiny bits. As you're selecting colors to fill with, try to contrast them as much as possible and don't use the same color more than once. This helps you get really clean edges and lets us select every object separately for coloring later on. When we're ready to move on to the next panels, I'm keeping the colors for the repeating objects the same. For example, the color of the alarm clock or the color of the wall. This means when I choose the colors for these areas in the next step, I can change them all at once. To do the actual colors, because we do not want the panels to look like they actually look from the last step, they're absolutely hideous, we're going to make a new layer and fill it with 50% gray. I will sometimes do a 75% gray if the colors are looking too dark, so adjust however you need to for that. This gives us a neutral surface to pick colors from instead of white, as that can skew things too light and we won't have enough of a range. I set the ugly flats layer to the reference, and now we're going to use the custom selection tool to select objects and pick the color for them. I tend to do the most important bits first, the people and charged objects in the scene, and then move on to the background stuff. Here again, we have several methods to get this done. You can use the fill bucket, you can use the fill icon that's located on the top bar, or you can use the selection, hue, saturation, luminosity slider. To set up this button in the selection launcher, go to the selection launcher settings and add layer, new correction layer, hue, saturation, luminosity. Now you'll have this little button on your selection bar that will allow you to change the color with small changes using your selection tools, rather than having to fill, find a new color, fill, find a new color over and over again. I made a small mistake here and forgot to add a little bit of saturation to my 50% gray. For some reason in Clip Studio, it cannot add saturation to 0. So use a fill for this layer that has a tiny color to it, and you should be able to change the selections using the new button. Because I use the same colors for like objects, I can fill in the rest of the page really quickly. And any adjustments that I need to make later will be really easy, and we'll adjust all of the colors for that object at the same time. After your flats are done, it's time to shade the panel. I went with a little bit more blended shading for this page, but the comic I'm working on is cel shaded, which is faster and a little bit more stylized. Lighting can be kind of hard. It helps me to focus on where the light's coming from, and I tend to take a done is better than perfect approach to shading. After the shadows are done, I'm going to go through and add highlights and glow effects to anything really close to the light or that's giving off its own light, like the computer screen. I'm using a light blue for the shadows because our ambient light is coming from the reflected light in the sky, and a pale yellow green for the highlights because the direct light will be more from the sun coming in the window. If you're struggling with this part of the process, I would recommend looking at some reference photos or even some reference 3D modeled rooms on something like Sketchfab. That way you can move around the space and look at the shadows from different sides. I found the more you study what light looks like in photos and in the real world, the better you'll be at rendering it from your imagination. That's about it for the process I use for coloring comics. There are a ton of cool effects and things you can add to it after you're done with these steps. Let me know if you guys want to see an advanced comic coloring video where we go over some sort of special use cases and things like that. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. If you're looking for more content like this, check out my recent video on blending techniques. You can support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing here on YouTube. You can also support the channel and my other projects over on Patreon like these awesome folks. This video is generously brought to you by Terribilly Jean, Anthony Jutz, Jesse C, Tuna, and Snooky. Thank you guys so much for your support, and we'll see you next time.